Beverly Hills, California. Spring 1960. The private dining room at Chasen's restaurant held 11 men and 1 woman, seated around a table dressed in white linen and crystal that caught the late afternoon light. Marilyn Monroe sat at the far end, her hands folded in her lap, listening to studio executives discuss her next picture as if she weren't there. The conversation had been pleasant enough for the first 20 minutes, but something in the air had shifted when Harry Cohn's former associate, a producer named Vincent Aldrich, leaned back in his chair and smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. He was about to say something, and everyone at that table knew it wouldn't be kind. What I'm going to share with you today is a story that was never meant to leave that room. If you want to hear more accounts like this, stories Hollywood kept in the shadows, make sure to subscribe, because some things were only whispered about back then, and they deserve to be remembered now. The meeting had been called to discuss budgets and schedules, ordinary business matters that required Marilyn's presence only as a formality. She had arrived on time, dressed simply in a navy dress with no jewelry, except small pearl earrings. The men spoke over her, redirected questions meant for her to her agent, and referred to her in third person while she sat 6 feet away. This wasn't unusual. It was how these meetings always went. But Vincent Aldrich had been drinking since lunch, and men like him didn't hold their tongues well when they'd had scotch and felt the protection of a room full of peers. He was talking about the film's publicity campaign when he shifted in his seat and looked directly at Marilyn for the first time that afternoon. "The thing about Monroe," he said to the man beside him, loud enough for the entire table to hear, "is that America loves a hard luck story. Foster homes, no father, started with nothing." He paused, swirling his drink. "We can use that. Sell the picture as her comeback. The orphan who made it, fell apart and climbed back up. People eat that up." The room went still, not silent but careful. Someone cleared their throat. Another man reached for his water glass. Marilyn didn't move. Her expression remained composed, her hands still folded, but something inside her chest tightened, the way it always did when her childhood was reduced to a marketing angle, a convenient narrative that powerful men could deploy when it suited them. She had learned long ago that her past didn't belong to her. It belonged to anyone who could profit from it. And Vincent Aldrich, a man who had never known hunger or loneliness or the particular shame of being unwanted, was now using it as a selling point for a movie she hadn't even agreed to make. He kept going. "I'm just saying, we lean into it. Fragile blonde, tough life, big heart. That's the angle. Hell, we could get her on the cover of Life again with the right pitch. People want to feel sorry for her. That's her appeal." He looked around the table, expecting agreement, validation, perhaps even laughter. A few men nodded, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge him. One executive, younger than the others, glanced at Marilyn, then quickly looked away. The producer sitting closest to Aldrich shifted his chair slightly, creating distance without making it obvious. Marilyn lifted her gaze and met Aldrich's eyes across the table. She didn't speak immediately. She let the silence grow, let it fill the space between them until it became something he had to notice. The room was waiting, not for an outburst, not for tears, just waiting to see if she would let it pass the way she always did, the way women in her position were expected to. But Marilyn had decided somewhere in the seconds between his words and hers that this particular cruelty wouldn't go unanswered. "Mr. Aldrich," she said quietly, her voice steady and clear, "my childhood isn't a publicity campaign, and if you think people feel sorry for me, you've misunderstood everything." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every man at that table heard her. She paused, then continued, each word measured. "I survived what I survived. I'm not ashamed of it. But I won't let you turn it into a punchline or a strategy session." The weight of her words settled over the room like dust. No one spoke. No one moved. Stories like this one were never recorded in official Hollywood accounts, but they happened, and they mattered. Stay with us to hear how this moment changed more than just one afternoon. Subscribe, because the next story might be even harder to believe. Vincent Aldrich's face flushed. He had expected compliance, perhaps a forced smile, maybe even agreement. He hadn't expected resistance, especially not delivered with such calm precision. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then thought better of it. The man beside him shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very interested in the menu in front of him. The youngest executive looked down at his hands. The balance of power in that room, which had always tilted toward men like Aldrich, had shifted without anyone quite understanding how. Marilyn reached for her glass of water and took a slow sip. Her hand didn't shake. She set the glass down and folded her hands again, waiting. The meeting's original purpose had evaporated. No one seemed to remember what they had been discussing before Aldrich spoke. The studio head at the opposite end of the table cleared his throat and suggested they take a short break. It was a face-saving gesture, an attempt to diffuse the tension without directly addressing what had just happened. Men filed out of the room in pairs, murmuring to each other, avoiding Marilyn's gaze as they passed. She remained seated. She knew that standing up and leaving immediately would look like retreat, like she had been hurt and needed to escape. So she stayed, alone in that room for a full 3 minutes, finishing her water and straightening the napkin in her lap. When she finally stood, she did so without hurry. She walked out through the restaurant's main dining room with her head up, nodding politely to the hostess, and stepped into the California sunlight where her car was waiting. Only then, sitting in the back seat with the door closed, did she allow herself to breathe differently. The story of what happened at Chasen's that afternoon didn't spread the way scandals did. There were no photographers, no gossip column mentions, no leaked statements, but it traveled nonetheless quietly through the network of assistants and agents and second-tier executives who heard things and passed them along. Within a week, 3 different people who hadn't been in that room mentioned it to colleagues. Within 2 weeks, it had reached New York. The detail everyone seemed to focus on wasn't what Aldrich had said. It was how Marilyn had responded. Calm, direct, unshakable. Vincent Aldrich himself never spoke of it publicly, but those who worked with him noticed a change. He was careful around actresses after that, more measured in his comments, quicker to apologize when he overstepped. Whether this came from genuine reflection, or simply from the realization that not every woman would stay silent, no one could say, but the shift was real. In an industry where reputations were built on dominance and maintained through fear, the story of a man who had been quietly, definitively put in his place carried a certain weight. For Marilyn, the incident became one of many. There would be other rooms, other men, other moments where her past was weaponized against her. But this particular afternoon marked something. Not a turning point exactly. She had always possessed the strength to stand up for herself. But perhaps it was the first time she realized that strength didn't require volume. It didn't require drama. It required only clarity, precision, and the willingness to name what was happening instead of pretending it wasn't. The film they had been discussing that day was eventually made, but with a different producer and a different tone. Marilyn's contract gave her script approval, a clause she had fought for years earlier, and now wielded with increasing confidence. The publicity campaign made no mention of foster homes or hard luck stories. Instead, it focused on her talent, her range, her ability to carry a dramatic role. Whether this was a direct result of that afternoon at Chasen's or simply a coincidence, no one could prove. But the people who had been in that room remembered the connection. In the months that followed, Marilyn found herself invited to smaller, more intimate gatherings, where the conversation was different. Directors and writers who had previously kept their distance began seeking her out, curious about the woman who had faced down Vincent Aldrich without raising her voice. These weren't friendships exactly. Hollywood didn't work that way. But they were alliances, quiet understandings between people who recognized each other's refusal to accept humiliation as part of the job. She didn't speak about the incident when these new colleagues asked, and they didn't press. The silence itself was the message. There were still men who underestimated her, still executives who spoke over her in meetings, still producers who thought they could manage her with flattery or intimidation. But the ones who knew, the ones who had heard what happened that spring afternoon, approached her differently. They listened when she spoke. They waited for her opinion instead of assuming they already knew it. This didn't make Hollywood kind, and it didn't erase the structural inequalities that governed every contract, every role, every decision. But it created small pockets of respect in an industry built on exploitation. Marilyn's acting coach, Paula Strasberg, noticed the change during their sessions that summer. Marilyn seemed more present, less apologetic about taking up space. When Paula asked if something had shifted, Marilyn only smiled and said she was learning to trust herself. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough. The work they did together became sharper, more focused. Marilyn began to question choices she had previously accepted without argument. She pushed back on line readings that felt false, on character motivations that didn't make sense. The directors who worked with her during this period later said she had become more difficult. What they meant was that she had become more certain. Vincent Aldrich's career continued without significant damage. He produced successful films, attended the right parties, maintained his position in the industry's upper echelons. But those who knew him well said he was never quite as confident after that spring. He drank more at dinners, talked less at meetings, and seemed to measure his words before speaking in ways he never had before. Whether this was growth or simply caution, whether he understood what he had done wrong or only that he had been caught doing it, remained unclear. Men like him rarely examined their behavior too closely. Years later, after Marilyn's death, a journalist researching her life tracked down several people who had been at Chasen's that afternoon. Most refused to speak on the record. One, the young executive who had looked away, agreed to talk on the condition of anonymity. He remembered the meeting vividly, he said, not because of what Aldrich said, which was cruel, but not unusual for that era, but because of Marilyn's response. She didn't yell, he recalled. She didn't cry. She just looked at him and told the truth, and it changed the whole room. I'd never seen anything like it. The journalist asked if anyone had apologized to Marilyn afterward. The executive paused for a long time before answering. No, he said finally. No one had apologized. They had all just pretended it hadn't happened, the way men in power always did when confronted with their own cruelty. They moved on to other meetings, other projects, other actresses. But the memory of that afternoon stayed with him, he admitted, longer and more clearly than most of the films he had worked on during that period. It stayed because it revealed something about dignity that he hadn't understood before. If this story resonated with you, there are others like it, moments that history overlooked but that tell us who these people really were. Subscribe to make sure you don't miss them. These aren't just stories about Hollywood. They're about what it costs to stand up when everyone expects you to stay silent. Marilyn never publicly discussed the incident. She gave hundreds of interviews in the years following that spring afternoon, but she never mentioned Vincent Aldrich or Chasen's or what had been said about her childhood. This wasn't because she had forgiven or forgotten. It was because she understood that her power came from what she chose not to say, as much as from what she did. The men who had been in that room knew what had happened. That was enough. Making it public would have turned it into spectacle, and spectacle was what they wanted from her. Silence, controlled and deliberate, was something else entirely. Her closest friends, the few people she trusted completely, heard pieces of the story over time. Never the full account, just fragments revealed during late-night phone calls or quiet dinners when her guard was down. They understood that these moments of cruelty were not isolated incidents but patterns, threads woven through her entire career. What impressed them wasn't that she had faced down powerful men. It was that she had done so without losing herself, without becoming bitter or cynical or mean in return. She remained vulnerable in her art, open in her relationships, willing to trust even when trust had been weaponized against her. The dining room at Chasen's continued to host Hollywood's elite for decades after that afternoon. The table where the meeting took place seated different executives, different stars, different deals made and broken over expensive meals. But every so often, someone who had been there in 1960 would walk past that table and remember Marilyn's voice, quiet and steady. Remember Vincent Aldrich's face, flushed with shame he would never acknowledge. Remember the way the room had held its breath, waiting to see if she would accept the humiliation or reject it. And remember that she had chosen rejection without needing to raise her voice. In the broader narrative of Marilyn Monroe's life, this incident barely registered. It wasn't dramatic enough for biographies, wasn't public enough for headlines, wasn't violent enough to shock. It was simply one afternoon, one conversation, one moment where a powerful man tried to diminish a woman and found himself unable to do so. But these small moments, accumulated over years, shaped who she became. They taught her that she didn't need permission to exist with dignity. They taught her that her past, painful as it was, belonged to her alone. They taught her that silence could be strength, and that calm could be devastating. The film industry has always run on unequal power, on hierarchies maintained through 1,000 small cruelties that never make the news. What happened at Chasen's that day was both exceptional and ordinary. Exceptional because Marilyn refused to accept it. Ordinary because it happened to every actress who ever worked in Hollywood, usually without witnesses, usually without consequence. The difference was that this time, there were witnesses. This time, the consequence was a shift in how at least a few men viewed their own behavior. It wasn't justice, not even close, but it was something. Marilyn continued working, continued fighting for better roles and more control over her career. She had victories and defeats, moments of triumph and periods of deep struggle. The incident at Chasen's didn't change the fundamental inequalities she faced, didn't make studios suddenly treat her with the respect she deserved, didn't erase the casual cruelty that characterized so much of Hollywood life, but it gave her something to hold on to. Proof that she could stand up for herself without destroying herself in the process. Proof that dignity didn't require performance. Proof that truth, spoken quietly, could be more powerful than any amount of rage. Vincent Aldrich died in 1971, his obituaries listing his successful films and industry contributions, without mention of the woman he had tried to humiliate over lunch one spring afternoon. The men who had been in that room went on to other careers, other controversies, other moments they would prefer to forget. Most of them are gone now. But the story survived, passed down through assistants who became executives, through younger actresses who heard it from older ones, through anyone who needed to know that resistance was possible even in rooms where power seemed absolute. The young executive who had looked away that afternoon became a studio head himself, years later. He made it a policy, he told colleagues, never to discuss an actor's personal history in business meetings. Some thought this was professional courtesy. Those who knew the story understood it was something else, a lesson learned from watching Marilyn Monroe refuse to let her pain become someone else's strategy. He never said her name when explaining this policy, but he didn't need to. The people who mattered knew where it came from. In the end, what happened at Chasen's mattered not because it was extraordinary, but because it was necessary. Necessary for Marilyn, who needed to know she could draw a line and have it respected. Necessary for the men in that room, who needed to understand that there were consequences, however subtle, for using someone's trauma as a punchline. Necessary for everyone who would come after, who would face similar moments, and need to know that quiet resistance was possible. The story didn't change Hollywood. Nothing could have done that. But it changed a room, and sometimes that's enough. Marilyn Monroe died too young, before she could see the full impact of the small rebellions she staged throughout her career. She never knew that decades later people would still talk about that spring afternoon, still reference it when discussing how power operates and how it can be resisted. She only knew that she had spoken the truth when it would have been easier to stay silent, and that the truth had been heard. In a life marked by so much noise, so much spectacle, so much performance, that quiet moment of honesty stood out. Not because it was loud, because it was real. The dining room at Chasen's is long gone now, demolished and rebuilt into something else. The men who sat around that table have mostly passed. The films they discussed have been forgotten or become footnotes in Hollywood history. But the story remains, carried forward by anyone who understands that dignity isn't given by powerful men. It's claimed by people who refuse to let their humanity be reduced to a marketing angle, who insist on being seen as whole, even when the world prefers them broken. Marilyn Monroe knew this long before that afternoon in Beverly Hills, but on that particular day, in that particular room, she made sure everyone else knew it too. This is the kind of story that doesn't make it into the official history books, but it tells us more about who these people really were than any press release ever could. If you want to keep hearing these accounts, these moments that reveal character instead of just chronicling fame, subscribe now, because the next story might be the one that changes how you see everything.